The war in Vietnam did not have its origins in the 60s, nor in the end of World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War. In reality, the origin of that conflict can be seen as far back as ancient history, where Vietnam had struggled for independence against any and all comers, and the early modern era, when France subdued the region for a number of decades. With the Indochina Peninsula, a geographic distinction more tied to French politics than it really ever was geographic or local realities, with it pacified, European colonialism set in. The goal was profit. Feudalism and the oaths to kings and church have been replaced by liberal democracies and capitalist profit motive. But with the Con Vuong and scholars' revolts defeated, with Tonkin and Annam pacified, with the Black Flags and the Chinese Qing armies defeated, with the Vietnamese monarchy subdued into a client position, the French were more or less able to exercise control over the majority of the country. Not every inch of the state was overrun with French soldiers. Military outposts did not pop up in every village, and there was no real attempt to Frankify every inch of Vietnamese soil. Instead, life continued, with the mandarins and the local elites and the various officials knew who was in charge. Not only were the colonizers now collecting taxes, raising local militias, and policing the populace, and making every government decision of real weight, but they had also proven their military might and their ability to force cooperation from the upper class. Resistance had been tried, and Europeans had devastated them on the battlefield and hunted their guerrilla militias to the ends of the earth. But this was not a unique experience. The same had occurred with China more than once in ages past, and each time the Vietnamese had, in due time, returned with a vengeance. It's not as though colonialism had been proven invincible either. The British had to relinquish the bulk of their North American colonies to the new United States, which would later snap up chunks of other colonial empires. Latin America had since been the cash cows of the Portuguese and Spanish empires, and broken away to become a patchwork quilt of fledgling states struggling against post-colonial influence and their powerful northern neighbor. France had already lost her colonial empire to wars with England, and because Napoleon sold about a third of what would become the US of A to Thomas Jefferson. If France had seen struggles before and underwent severe downturn, it was not for the last time. The 20th century was both the climactic high point of European and Western power and also its dramatic splintering. In the First World War, the powerful empires of Europe waged a violent total war from 1914 to 1918. From the seeds of this conflict would come the Great Depression, the Second World War, and the dramatic reorganization of the world in a Cold War chess game. The First World War, which laid bare the pure moral bankruptcy of a conflict which consumed over 17 million lives for seemingly no reason other than strutting national aggrandizement. From these ashes came a new world. The Russian Revolution was the first successful Marxist revolt and gave a clearly different route than parliamentary politics. This coarse, violent, armed revolution, while it might have appealed less to the comfortable, wealthy nations of the West, had appeals for the colonized people of the world toiling under the boot heel of their colonizers. Welcome back for episode 8 of the History Hour. This is Mr. Kent.
And I'm Professor White.
We come to you this time following up with our next installation on the Vietnam War series. We will now be discussing what happened after the Tonkin Campaign and Sino-French War played out and Indochina was organized under a French colonial administration. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Vietnam was to become less westernized than French politicians claimed it would be, but at the same time likely was influenced more by the outside world, in particular the Russian Revolution, than their colonial overlords would have ever wanted.
By the 1890s, active military resistance to French occupation of Vietnam had more or less come to an end. There would still occasionally be flare-ups of violence, but any kind of organized resistance had basically died out and would remain so for some decades. With the region secure, France then set about organizing this new colony, essentially for its maximum return on investment, or so they hoped. The plan was to establish sort of a multi-level system. At the core of it, you have the French Governor General, a Frenchman appointed by the government in Paris, whose job it was to basically make all of the real decisions, policies, manage the tax systems, punish dissidents, those sorts of things. but a fig leaf to disguise their actual open control, as well as a certain degree of, one might almost call it French romanticism for the exotic Oriental traditions. The actual royal court in Hui was maintained. Kings were still on the throne. There was still a local civil service of elites, mandarins, who still went through the traditional civil service testing and received their, the direct translation is dragon hat, which indicated they had passed the testing. And despite the fact that this was openly a joke, there are actually recorded cases of several emperors of Vietnam who openly laughed at some of the ceremonies they officiated, knowing that it was purely hollow and ridiculous. But there's still status associated with being a Confucian scholar. There is still opportunities for mandarins who are willing to bend the knee and join the French, take the money, and serve essentially as the French stick that came to suppressing the population. That was sort of the secret motive of this whole thing, if you want to think about it in that sense. By having native collaborators be the ones to do most of the, not open, but most of the most direct oppression, such as tax collection, corvée labor enforcements, and the like, the French were, in theory, able to deflect a great deal of resentment away from themselves, although the actual effectiveness of this is debatable.
Jules Harmon, the commissioner of Annam, said in 1892, "The government and administration of this possession cannot be constituted the same way as in Europe. It must take on a paternal form. In the political sense of this word, we must never allow anyone to question our right and our firm intention not to share any of the roles of leadership and action that are necessarily the privileges of the conqueror, and which he cannot abandon without compromising his domination. The English have already appreciably gone beyond this limit. It is already difficult for them to go back, and perhaps they will never be able to regain the lost ground. Let us make sure we know how to take advantage of these warnings in order that we may define, from now on, the limits we should never exceed."
It's pretty obvious that the civil service system was a joke, and numerous people made note of this. Numerous Vietnamese writers made note of mocking people who would bow down to the French to accept their degrees. Though there's also a wide degree of envy for it as well, that yes, these collaborators had betrayed their nation and trampled upon traditions and debased themselves, but some grew quite wealthy doing it. And in a nation racked by poverty, well, wealth has its own appeal. Like I said, the administration of the royal court and the Mandarin bureaucracy really are just kind of another branch of the French colonial administration. Real power rests with the governor general, and French policy is set either by him or by Paris itself. When looking at French policy in what they call the Indochina colonies, which is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, although Laos and Cambodia remain relatively undeveloped until later, they're mostly just sort of claimed as a buffer against British colonies in the region rather than for direct economic value at first.
And there is some evidence that France had some aims on Siam, so Laos and Cambodia were sort of stepping stones into the Siamese sphere of influence as well, but they never got around to fully annexing that.
And the irony being that Britain and France kind of made a gentleman's agreement to leave Siam as a buffer between their two colonial spheres, though I don't think anyone ever actually told the Siamese that. French policy really can be divided into two rough periods. There's the pre-1870s policies and the post-1870s policies. The pre-1870, you're still the Second French Empire, still Napoleon III. And while certainly these colonies have an economic motive at that time, a lot of that really was Napoleon trying to rebuild French prestige, reestablish France as a great power, to insert his country back into the whole international competition system that the British were dominating at that period of time. One could almost argue that for Napoleon III, the economic benefits of Indochina were almost secondary to the political and prestige goals he had in international politics. But after the Franco-Prussian War, after the fall of the Empire, Napoleon III, the emergence of the New Republic, the colonies began to become more openly economic. Now, prestige is still a big deal. After all, as we mentioned in the last episode, the idea of recovering French prestige after the humiliation the Germans had handed them was important. But at the same time, the motive really does now seem to be openly making money. And you can see this in all kinds of ways. Probably the most direct and most telling is that on French documents and policy statements, these regions were referred to as the colonie d'exploitation, which literally means colony of economic exploitation. They weren't pretending they were doing anything else but that, at least in government circles.
That's all about like having a bank statement that reads, the institution of corruption, money laundering.
One can almost admire the honesty. The goal here was maximum profit for minimum work. Although maximum profit for certain people, primarily the French government and certain French industries and corporations that were kind of in good with the current powers that be.
It was kind of funny because this whole thing started off a little bit further behind than the French had optimistically suspected. They had estimated the revenue of Tonkin after they captured it would be about 40 million francs. It turned out to be about 15 million. As well, when they actually engaged in these conquests, the conquest of Cochin China cost about 80 million francs too. It then cost about 750 million to actually pacify the region. Initial French exploitation essentially was just throwing big piles of money on the ground and lighting it on fire.
It's kind of interesting. Certain cartels, basically groups of corporations that were contracted to do a lot of the exploitation, economic, resource extraction, made loads of money, but the French government made very little at all of the colonies. Although that's kind of the story of imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Corporations profited, governments hemorrhaged cash to keep them in business. Revenue policy kind of fell along two broad lines: direct colonial government revenue policies and what I call resource policies, or resource extraction policies. The revenue policies are actually pretty straightforward. There were a series of taxes, mostly property taxes, primarily upon farmers. These were usually paid in goods like rice and other high-value products, though could also be paid in cash as well, depending on what you grew. In addition to this, the French had seized large territories, which they would later set up as plantations. These weren't slave-worked plantations, though the conditions on them were certainly as horrendous as any plantation in the Old South.
And there were often legal conditions to bind the plantation workers to the plantation, so in reality a lot of them couldn't leave, so it's not completely accurate to say it might as well have been slave labor in some areas.
I suppose technically it's more like serfdom. But a lot of, essentially, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, worked on these plantations, and thus you paid direct rents to the colonial government in order for the right to work upon the lands. In addition to this, the French attempted and largely succeeded in monopolizing the big markets. Essentially, there wasn't much in the way of local manufacturing going on in Vietnam. In fact, even traditional forms of manufacturing like spinning of cloth, the brewing of rice wine, most of these were outlawed. You had to basically sell your produce to French companies who would then export that either back to France or other colonies to produce into finished goods, which they would import back in and sell. So other than maybe food, which could be grown locally and used locally, virtually everything is being purchased through French suppliers. And that becomes doubly profitable to the French because you're taxing the export that people are selling, and then you are taxing the import that's coming in, as well as often actually doing the selling yourself. And so they're making money 3 times off the same product.
Some of the notable ones include monopolies on alcohol, tobacco, cotton, oil refining, soap manufacturing, and sugar, as well as a gambling monopoly, an opium monopoly, and a massive salt tax.
The alcohol tax and monopoly was actually particularly egregious because rice spirits of various types are super important in traditional Vietnamese religion and a lot of the festivals and ceremonies that were held at all levels. And now you can only buy it from the French. You had to buy it through these certain suppliers, and it's been estimated that through the export, refining, import, which had to be bottled in certain types of bottles, and you had to buy certain kinds of government stamps to import and export. It's estimated that the actual cost of buying these spirits from French suppliers was about 900% higher than what it had been previously. So that kind of price gouging is kind of the norm, really, under French colonial policy.
All of this commerce where they're exporting back to Vietnam and using it to sell goods, that was one of the initial reasons for gaining Vietnam to begin with, was not only the access to the Chinese markets, which they so coveted that the British had access to, but it was the idea that as France had developed in this Industrial Revolution, the metropolitan urban areas increasingly were creating this glut of goods they were selling for massive profits to the rural areas of France. But as industry grew, production increased at a rate greater than population growth, they could no longer make the sort of profits they had because the market was glutted, and they were looking for export markets. But these export markets, competing with German merchants and British industry as well as terrorist nations, it was much more profitable to capture a nation like Vietnam, which had no local industry and was a captive market to sell your goods at whatever amount at whatever rate you wanted to.
Of course, as we noted, the actual profit from Vietnam was much lower than expected, and when they began to realize they weren't selling as much as they thought they should, they then added what they called the quota system. Basically, based on census data, the colonial government calculated how much of what items each village should be buying, and essentially said, you have to buy this much per month, per village, or we'll assume you're involved in smuggling or illicit distilling and moonshining, basically. Oh, police raid time. They tried to basically establish these economic monopolies, and then when they weren't profitable enough, they engaged in price gouging. Still wasn't profitable enough. They then basically enforced minimum sales purchases by law and used military force to back it up.
It is funny when we're looking at this sort of god tier of capitalism, this insane, 19th, 20th century colonialism, industrialism, how little free market there is. And it's all state monopolies and captive markets and forced central planning in order to harvest every red cent you can.
And Neil Jameson, who wrote a very good book called Understanding Vietnam, pointed out that this was capitalism with a vengeance, but neither free nor enterprising. Now, beyond these various, essentially mercantilist policies, even though they're not really that, you then had a very useful, I won't say profitable, government certainly wasn't, but useful resource industry. Vietnam, another major reason to move into the region in the first place, was that it had access or could use to produce various rare materials. Tea, rice, coffee, pepper, rubber, later zinc, tin, and coal could all be either grown there easily or extracted there in relatively large amounts. And these are all resources which are either valuable luxuries. Coffee and tea are very profitable in Europe. Rice is actually quite a valuable crop in the Western world at this time. Of course, the rest are incredibly useful as industrial resources, especially rubber. When you move into the 20th century and the automobile boom, rubber suddenly becomes a huge market, and Vietnam is a natural producer, a natural area where rubber trees can be grown.
In fact, rubber is so profitable that prior to the planting of larger rubber plantations in Cambodia, even though France had more or less annexed the region and added to their empire, very little French settlement even happened in the neighboring region of Cambodia. It was actually, most of the industry there was owned and worked in by Chinese and Vietnamese living in Cambodia. It was only after rubber arrived that they even looked at that frontier region as being in any way profitable.
But while some of these resources, like rice, for example, could be extracted through various tax methods, the other resources would need to be large extraction operations to be organized. The state wasn't going to do it, so instead they basically established what some call the cartel system. Essentially, large corporate entities in France were given explicit permission by the French government to establish monopolies inside the colonies. This is really not the creation, but the massive growth of the plantation systems to grow spices and rubber trees and coffee and tea plants, but also to establish large mining operations. And as we mentioned, through various systems of sharecropping, tenant farming, various legal loopholes, convict labor, and the like, they were able to produce not only these state-enforced monopolies that vastly enriched these cartels and also allowed France to gain huge amounts of these resources. As we said, it basically establishes they hoped at least, permanent underclass of Vietnamese citizens if you just cheap labor, with no real worry about unionization or strikes or protests in the newspapers about poor working conditions.
But that also means, because of how poor the conditions are and how little these people are getting paid, in addition to the fact that the rubber plantations often got a large amount of land by essentially seizing it from more inland tribes without any sort of compensation or very small compensation, the overhead's little. These plantations are hugely profitable most of the time because they have so little money going into the base product. Later on in the 20th century, coal mining actually becomes a major profitable industry, and they begin to strip mine areas of Tonkin of coal. By 1939, from Tonkin they were exporting 1.8 million tons. Well, they were second only behind Manchuria in Asian coal production.
Now the problem, of course, is while there's all these potential opportunities for economic exploitation, resource extraction, industry, low overhead, cash crop production, Vietnam doesn't really have anything in the way of infrastructure, really. a very basic road system, a few very small harbors. There hadn't been a need for it before French occupation. The French colonial government, and this is one of the reasons why it's so expensive to maintain this colony, goes on an infrastructure building spree. In 1897, a man named Paul Doumer is appointed as Governor General of Indochina, and he will hold that position for about 5 years. And it is during his time that France really begins a rapid development process. Now, this is development purely for the benefit of their military position and their economic position. It's not really meant to give benefits to the people, although certainly the people would pay for it. During his tenure and afterwards, a dizzying amount of construction would occur. Numbers of roads, many miles of roads are carved through the jungle to connect the various areas, port cities. Railroads will follow. Literally thousands of bridges are constructed. Now, most of these bridges are little tiny things meant to cross small streams. In fact, in an example again of a little bit of capitalism in action, the Eiffel Company in Paris won a contract to produce modular bridge systems, which they exported in the thousands to Vietnam, many of which are still there. American troops commented on the Eiffel bridges in the Mekong Delta, which were very dangerous to cross. They were good ambush points. But larger bridges as well. For example, in Hanoi, they built a massive bridge across the Red River. It's called the Domer Bridge, or at least it was, in honor of the Governor General. I'm sure the locals were thrilled about that. The local superstition at the time was that the river had a powerful spirit, which would never allow it to be bridged. And, watching these French ships drive piles into the earth, they were sure the river would rise up and destroy them, and of course it didn't. Which, I guess, for many locals might reinforce the idea of French power that even nature itself bent to the whims of their conquerors. This, combined with large flood control projects in the Red River region, which had been a very violent and flood-prone river, while that probably is useful for locals, it also helps to accelerate the growth of rice plantations in the region, which, of course, again, serves French interests. Saigon is expanded to a massive port with deep water bays. It's called the French Singapore by some, which is mostly the French trying to play it up as an important city rather than actual reality. Military outposts, while not everywhere, are constructed. And again, these are weird little things, often evincing French colonial architecture, towers and walls and mounds, some of which are still there. Again, the American phase of the Vietnam War begins. There's a lot of comment about these various French outposts, which are still being manned by the South Vietnamese army at this point. Of course, in the cities where the most construction occurs, Saigon and Hanoi in particular, mostly to create what some might call the French quarters. Basically big, often the most luxurious or most desirable parts of the cities, which were turned over to housing for French colonists or administrators, or various government buildings, military buildings, and the like. In these, not only did they champion the so-called French colonial architecture, which is still a reasonably common style in Southeast Asia today, but they also built huge cathedrals and theaters and racetracks and gymnasiums and tennis courts and all kinds of Western luxuries meant to make the lives of the French citizens in Vietnam easier. And while it's not outright stated, I have to imagine that a lot of Vietnamese who are looking over the fences or maybe peering over the hedgerows at these possible luxuries that these French were living in, that had to sting. That had to really just feed the envy and that hate that was growing under the surface. Doumer, especially, though other governors as well, often would massively underestimate the cost of the projects they undertook, and massively overestimate the benefits of them. Now, it's hard to say exactly how much all of this collectively cost, because the French budgetary records are total expenses for everything, including the pay of soldiers and everything else, but most of this was paid for by local taxes and by what's called corvée labor, which is a labor tax. Now, corvée labor is a very old idea. The ancient Egyptians and Babylonians, and before that, practiced it, where part of your tax revenue wasn't paid in money, it was paid in labor to the state. But the corvée system in Vietnam was especially exploitative, and it's been likened by numerous people as essentially an institutionalized system of slavery. And we do know that thousands died on these massive construction projects, and numerous regions were impoverished by extra supplementary taxes to pay for them. The actual benefit to the French colonial system was probably minimal. Yes, the roads and railroads allowed them to create these resource extraction operations. Yes, the creation of these roads allowed them to move soldiers more effectively, but the amount of profit they generated is debatable, to say the least, and despite French pretensions likewise, Saigon never became one of the great ports of Southeast Asia than they hoped it would.
They were known to be fairly inefficient. For example, most of the commerce still didn't happen to be a road, it happened to be a river. It was just easier to ship things on a boat down the Mekong River, which just, it connected the entire delta. And during most of the existence of Indochina, the trains actually carried more passengers than they did freight on their journeys.
It's telling to note that even as late as the 1960s, the rivers were still the primary means of moving goods and people in the South, which is something I don't think anyone ever caught on to. That's how the VC were moving so effectively. They would put tons of ammunition, heavy weapons on little canoes and move them wherever they wanted. But beyond this, there was some limited industrialization in Vietnam as well. This mostly occurs after 1900, but slowly and painfully between, say, 1900 and 1920, limited industrial elements begin to emerge. But even this is designed to feed into the export economy. There is some production of finished rubber products, just because it's more efficient to produce it locally than export it there. There is some production of textiles locally, some production of tobacco, alcohol, cement for construction. But again, most of this was being used either for export or to fund various French building projects. It wasn't really an economic development of the country the way industrialism is usually seen as.
Humorously, there were actually a number of various projects attempted that just ended up as failures. Until 1928, very little actual planning went in, and most of these were very slapdash attempts. Cochin Chinese coffee, indigo, sugar, and cotton all were attempted and ultimately more or less proved unprofitable. In fact, in 1910, various silk manufacturers who wanted to decrease the cost of importing silks from China and Japan around the tariffs decided to establish local silk manufacturers in Vietnam, which ended up being 20% more expensive than the initial price. Many of the western provinces where these land clearance projects began and European-owned plantations were established essentially went out of business shortly after creation or sold off to local settlers or Mandarin and local elites who ended up just turning them into more rice cultivation areas. A lot of these projects were attempted unsuccessfully and just abandoned. Cement, though, did actually prove to be one of the most profitable industries, and after it was established, it exported 80% of its product. But all the various industry and infrastructure and everything else was either secondary or supplemental or entirely in service of the main product of Indochina, the thing that ultimately would make the vast majority of its profit and be its greatest export and what it was best known for, which was the rice. The rice paddies of Indochina produced a pretty substantial amount of food. As the French took over, they basically had the vision of maximizing this, of clearing more land and taking a certain part of every farmer's harvest through the various local elites and Mandarin upper class, of course, and then once extracting it, export it for sale. The massive building projects that were established, a lot of them actually had to do about land clearance, about irrigation, damming up parts of the river, making them essentially irrigatable and profitable, and reselling individuals. In 1866, 21 new provinces were established in the western areas of Vietnam and Indochina in order to start clearing using more of these agricultural hinterlands. Between 1860 and 1928, rice exports from Vietnam increased 30-fold. By the end, Indochina rice made up about 1/4 of all global rice exports and was 60% of all money that Indochina was bringing in via exports. They exported rice to South China and Hong Kong. They exported rice to the East Indies and imported gasoline. They traded fish, tin, and rubber to Singapore, and then to US, Japan, and France. Cambodian livestock and Indo-Chinese rice were sent to the Philippines. Rice, coal, and rubber were sent to Japan between 1913 and 1932. During the entire time, the Chinese were actually one of the largest markets. Indochina represented about 4 to 6% of China's total imports, and doubled the shares that France had in the Chinese market. Of the rubber, the U.S. was one of the major importers, and by 1940 was importing 72,000 tons a year. A huge deal of the influence was wielded by the banking institutions in Indochina, particularly the Bank of Indochina. These institutions were not actually the typical investment banks. They were not established to, say, offer credit and money to local areas and to safeguard money. What they were actually more established for was, one, to assist with large commercial endeavors of capitalists, but the much bigger reason was the facilitation of export via the controlling of currencies and the exchanging of the piastre and the franc and the local Chinese currencies. The Indochinese piastre was modeled after the Mexican piastre, which was strong at the time, at that time linked to silver. Silver actually being much more common in Asian markets, what the Japanese and the Chinese used. Would prove to be a fatal flaw. In 1873 through 1914, the price of silver dropped, and the Indo-Chinese economy, as well as other economies in Asia, did suffer as a result. Ultimately, through 1915 to 1921, reevaluation of inflation would occur for silver and the piastre. In 1925, there would be stabilization, before ultimately in 1928, they'd be put on the gold standard. During the period of deflation in the 1870s through early 1900s, the investors and capitalists of Indochina actually exported even more of the goods than they had previously because it was seen as so unprofitable to convert into piastres. Instead, they would extract as much as they could in order to convert into currency elsewhere in order to maximize their profit. Though, in 1920 through 28, when the franc was in crisis, it did actually show a short period of increased investment in Indochina. What all this meant in the end was that Indochina did make a profit. Indochina's exports were not in deficit until the Great Depression. Indochina, for the amount of money they put in for pacification and conquest and building this infrastructure, if it wasn't returned to the government, it was returned to the investors and the capitalists. A 1929 estimate by Henry Simoni was that private profit was at least 400 to 500%. The Bank of Indochina remained profitable during the worst parts of the Depression when the average Vietnamese citizens were suffering terribly. And in fact, wealth was extremely regional. In Cochinchina, the average wealth was 600 francs per person. In Nam and Tonkin, it was 128. It was due to the fact that Cochinchina was the center of exports, and that was concentrated in the hands of a few. The actual regional wealth of Asia was closer to 180, the average wealth of places like China and India. In addition to all this, despite whatever economic conditions there were, France had the benefit of whenever there was needed extra cash, they would impose tariffs and fees in Indochina to just rack up the additional profits. Jules de la Fosse, the Bonaparte's deputy from Calvados, the Chamber of Deputies, in 1885, said, "To wish to colonize Asia is to pursue an illusion and to flirt with danger. You have not fully understood that the Asiatic populations are our equals, that they have enjoyed a civilization older than ours, that it endures in their memories and their pride. They were free and will want to be free again. It is not difficult to predict that in contact with our civilization, with the wind of ideas of emancipation that are circulating throughout the world, they will quickly feel the need for independence, which is the goal and the honor of all peoples, awakened and ferment. They will revolt one day, and their revolt will necessarily triumph, because it is the immortal privilege of liberty to triumph everywhere."
So in the wake of all of this exploitation and suffering and just terrible conditions, how did the Vietnamese, who are historically a people not willing to suffer such abuses lightly, actually respond to it? Well, after the end of active resistance in late 1800s, there are a couple of different groups and movements and philosophical ideas that emerge to try and deal with the new reality which they're facing. Neil Jameson, who I mentioned before, refers to this first phase as the yin reaction, referring to the Taoist idea of yin and yang, active and passive, different ideas and cycles. But essentially what it is with active resistance having proven ineffectual, in fact in some cases having failed disastrously, the vast majority of people sort of resigned themselves to accepting French domination, at least in the short term. But accepting it didn't mean they were simply going to acknowledge it as right and proper and not try to resist in other ways. Now, while some decided to take what they could get, and thus became what we would call collaborators with the French regime, either serving directly as bureaucracy or serving as tax officials, colonial militiamen, village heads, those sorts of things, a significant minority decided to actually go the opposite direction. They chose to withdraw from the world, to use their term. The most famous case of this is a man known as Phan Thanh Yan, who had kind of been around since first French arrival in some cases. He had a hugely successful career as a mandarin serving the imperial court. I believe he had earned something like 23 royal awards of service in the course of his lifetime. He was actually the one, at one point in the 1860s, sent to negotiate with the French. And when he realized there was no hope of actually getting anything they wanted in the treaty and no hope of resisting militarily after that, and he himself was actually in command of one of these garrisons who was defeated at the time, he chose to, again, withdraw both symbolically and physically. He delayed just long enough to not give orders to his men so they wouldn't actually fight, thus saving their lives, resigned every one of his titles, commissions, returned all of his awards to the royal court along with a letter of resignation, assuming full responsibility for the disaster, and then committed suicide. And in this symbolism, he was basically saying that I understand I cannot win, I understand that I cannot achieve victory, I cannot do what I am supposed to do as a man of my position and rank, but I refuse to buckle under as well. And while that resistance is purely symbolic, in a lot of ways it harkens back to previous centuries, the famous mandarins of the Tang or Yuan eras who refused to buckle under, who fought to the bitter end, who died valiantly, or simply chose to kill themselves to avoid humiliation. And men like him would become new powerful cultural examples in the coming decade. Others were less extreme in that they chose not to kill themselves, but a huge number, again, a small percentage in total, but still a large number of people, chose more symbolic abstention. Again, they resigned commissions, they returned diplomas, they refused to take the testing. Some actually feigned infirmities. There was a famous man who feigned being deaf to avoid a government appointment. Others became monks. Most chose to retreat back into the rural village system, often assuming no titles, becoming poets or monks or shamans, and becoming, again, symbolic points of resistance inside these rural communities, even if they weren't actually active resistance.
The village really served as sort of the heart of the Vietnamese social structure. The vast majority of Vietnam lived in rural communities. Only a small minority lived in areas like Saigon, Hanoi. Most instead were in these large communal areas, usually dominated by the same sort of elite families and power brokers and wealthy individuals who probably held power for centuries through various dynasties. But these rural elites, who were usually operating under some auspices with the French, did things like make appointments, sell taxation, as well as make decisions on things like land redistribution. As well, these rural elites were often ones to sign the tax burden, which inevitably fell on the peasants more heavily than it did these elites. All this sort of beyond the actual old school mandarins going into seclusion out of a sense of resistance, and these rural elites, often the ones who retain power, being willing to collaborate, it created this sort of undermining of this village solidarity, this sort of communal structure which had been in place for generations, which was really part of the fabric of Vietnamese social life. It was beginning to be torn apart by the co-opting these various peoples. And in fact, the French tried their own hand at breaking their power by appointing their own representatives in each village, a Lai Truong. Though, almost always the rural elites, these village notables, would just operate behind the scenes with their own feudal-like patronage networks of clients and make the Lai Truong either one of their own clients and co-opt their own power or make them irrelevant. Ultimately, the French would have to adopt that and just go back to working with the actual powers that be. Nguyen Van Huyen also wrote, "The introduction of what is called communal reform has been in vain. With its council composed of a president, a treasurer, and a secretary, in the image of private associations, it has just complicated the situation to the detriment of the central administration against which the village has always risen up. For the chieftainship is elsewhere. There is a mentality to be changed, an organization rooted in very strong interests which penetrates the deepest layer of society that needs to be altered. Otherwise, all effort at reform will be no more than window dressing." All of this occurs in the backdrop of abject poverty and suffering for a huge percentage of the Vietnamese population. If we take the later revolutionary movement of Vietnam, these communist movements, and we look at the ideology of Marx, this is a population that isn't exactly ready for revolution. When you look at these figures saying that revolution isn't the path forward, or at least not yet, later communists might well have agreed that it's a population which is basically oppressed. They do not have any sort of consciousness. They do not have any sort of organization. The French are entrenched in power. There is no sort of conditions for the classic revolution as you would imagine. Instead, as we've said, the vast majority of Vietnam are peasants. There are people in these various communities in the rural districts of Annam and Tonkin. In Cochinchina, it still exists, though Cochinchina is a little bit more interesting in that it's pretty much a mix of a number of traditions, both Vietnamese and Cambodian, with a little bit of Siamese traditions upon there too. And then with the French coming, it becomes the most Frankified region. But Overall, the system of these villages where they would do land redistribution has a long, long history, where by this period typically what they had done was every 3 years the lands would be redistributed to soldiers, to widows, and orphans, those without lands, and some of the lands would be used for religious purposes. However, even by the time the French arrived, some of this distribution stopped by the late Nguyen dynasty. And now, during the French period, some sections of lands were no longer redistributed. They remained in the hands they were currently in, or instead divvied out to various clients of the rural elites, rather than traditionally those who were supposed to be given the lands. Others, instead, after being divvied out, would not be redistributed anymore. Other times, it was that every 3 years there would be an auction held for the lands. A lot of this social strife, a lot of the national movements and people seeking inequality came from these rural groups and these village communities seeing the loss, seeing the potential to lose forever the lands of their family and their communities, and also suffering under an increasingly high tax burden. Increasingly in Vietnam, even with the rice economy being the dominant mechanism of export and profit, increasingly farming was done and the profit was really extracted from large landowners and their vast armies of indebted tenant farmers rather than traditional small villages and small landholders. As mentioned, taxes have increased during the time of the French as compared to before. At times, it could be up to 1/3 of an individual's income. Economic uncertainty and this massive tax burden at times caused people to struggle to make ends meet and would cause these migratory patterns of workers. Some would leave their villages during non-harvest and playing seasons and work seasonally before returning. Others would go and work at mines and plantations for 3 years before returning to the village in hopes of not losing their lands. This sort of thing would further contribute to the breakdown of traditional communities and traditional sort of family village groups. Wage earning, toil, working, migration, going to cities oftentimes would replace old filial piety and replace old family village traditional networks. In a 1911 debate on Indochina in the Chamber of Deputies, the French leader Jean Jaurès said, "The natives whose taxes you have doubled, tripled, and quintupled, whose resources and hope you devoured on a daily basis. Natives who had perhaps hesitated when you arrived, who perhaps said of France's renown, these are armed men, were perhaps also friends who have arrived. Well, you took their resources from them. You built not useful, modest works for them, such as irrigation schemes for the rice fields, or roads for their personal traffic, or for that their poor vehicles. You built superb railways that were the pretext for fruitful loans for shameful enterprises. Why? Because you were party to this false principle that was necessary from the beginning that colonies be a source of profit for France."
Around the turn of the 20th century, symbolic resistance took a new step with the emergence of a new literary tradition. Now, understand, even though literacy itself is a relatively rare skill at this time in most parts of Asia, literature itself, usually poetry, has a very strong cultural tradition in Japan, China, Indochina, Korea, all these regions. And so even if you couldn't read, these poems were often recited to each other. They passed down through word of mouth. And a number of people, both former mandarins who had chosen to seclude themselves and others who were resisting as well, increasingly began to use literature as a way to bring attention to the issues of the day, to, in often a very tongue-in-cheek or indirect way, lampoon collaboration, vilify the French, draw attention to how much things have changed and for the worse. And it was done in such a subtle way, often with allusions and metaphors, that someone who only really knew Vietnamese history could understand, that it wasn't really seen as anything particularly dangerous by the colonial powers. In fact, literature of that sort will be a hugely important part of Vietnamese resistance really up into World War II. Some of the earliest poets, though, were still not willing to take the final step of advocating any kind of open resistance. It was more, again, of a drawing of awareness for the situation. Two notable poets of this period who emerge around the turn of the 20th century are Nguyen Huyen and Tran Te Duong. Again, both men of good families, both who had turned down lucrative appointments in the colonial government and chosen to live kind of in dignified poverty instead of undignified riches, as it were, wrote extensively on this. they talk about how it has become an unnatural period, how traditional cultural norms, traditional political and economic ideas, traditional, again, social values seem to be eroding under the domination of these foreign powers. They draw attention to how ludicrous it is for anyone to, with a clean conscience, work with the French. One in particular, one of these men, Tran Zhuang, writes a very interesting poem in which he comments on one of these civil service exams, the one that occurred in 1896, with the new governor, Paul Domer, actually being the officiator who would hand out the diplomas to the candidates. And he points out that these are men, young men of talent and skill, who have competed in these ancient and honorable traditions, all for the honor of standing in a row while a French brass band plays, and the French governor and his wife, who women weren't going to be allowed at this ceremony, by the way, would give them each a diploma and a pocket watch as a thanks for their achievements and, of course, to lure them into French service. And he says, how can we take this seriously? How can we call this sacred? How can we call this anything if it is clearly just a farce of itself? Though, at the same time, he also points out that, oh, but how I envy them and their honors and their titles. So who then is the true fool? So again, he also laughs at himself, which is a way to make it more palatable, perhaps, to anyone who might be listening. Other poems are more historical in nature. They kind of have this wistful remembrance of what were things like before the French came, how much better things were, how much simpler things were. And again, very few of these say anything incredibly profound. Again, that lampooning of the civil service is one of the more profound of them. But it does help to keep sort of alive in cultural memory this period before French occupation. It helps to popularize a new literary tradition which takes colonialism as its primary subject. And that will go on to become a larger and larger and larger movement in the decades to come. Now, for example, by the, again, 1900, 1905 sort of period, and this begins to accelerate, there's a lot more talk about hasty of the French, the cheapening of social values, the breakdown of family and village, the fact that so many people are willing to bend their principles and essentially commit crimes against their own people, all for the sake of a little security or a little wealth. But, again, none of these poems really were willing to advocate any solution to this. They didn't have a solution. In fact, a lot of these men were really more nostalgically looking back at a past, which the oldest of them could remember, and the younger ones had heard about from their fathers and grandfathers. By around 1910, the vast majority of this first wave of protest writers and poets are either dead, mostly from old age, or have simply moved on to other pursuits. But the tradition they created would live on. By 1910, a new generation of reformers have begun to emerge who have decided to take that next step and say, all right, we identify the problem. What do we do about it? The first big movement to advocate, what do we do to get the French out of the country? What do we do to reestablish independence? Called the Dong Du movement, which can be translated as go east or travel east. There's a number of people involved in this. Probably the two most famous members are a man named Fan Boi Chao, who we mentioned briefly in our first episode, and a member of the royal family, Prince Hong Day. Now, these were two men who basically, they're a fascinating pair of figures, honestly. They have a very complex history. They're nationalists. They also believe in Western modernization, although they're looking to Japan as a sort of go east. They're looking at Japan saying, oh, look at the way the Japanese were able to modernize and industrialize and westernize without sacrificing their traditional social ideas, which kind of ignores the fact that Japan threw a ton of tradition out the window to do what it did. But still, the idea of being able to blend traditional culture with Western ideas to strengthen the country and attain the kind of power to stand with the great powers was immensely appealing to men like this.
In some later periods, in addition to Japan, China finally began to be a sort of figure they were looking to again with figures like Sun Yat-sen and
Chiang Kai-shek. Now, the Go East movement has its origins in the early parts of the 1900s, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that by this point a lot more Western literature is trickling into the country. A lot of it from China and Japan, which had been translated into languages that those who were literate in Chinese could understand. And so there's a lot more understanding of Western political thought, Western scientific ideas. Some of the seminal works of the Enlightenment, for example, were brought into the country at this time. And so men again like Fan and Hongdae were like, okay, there's a lot of potential value to be had here, and if we can, again looking at Japan, for example, take the best parts of Europe and the best parts of Vietnam, we can form them into a new synthetic whole and become a great and powerful country. We can modernize ourselves. 1904 is kind of the year in which this movement really takes off, because that's the year the Russo-Japanese War happened. And while Japan had been acknowledged as a rising power by many, the fact that it was able to defeat a great power like Russia, which no one in Europe called, suddenly gave a lot of weight to the idea that the modernization along the Japanese model is clearly an effective way to do this. And so with that, these men form a group called the Association for the Modernization of Vietnam. And again, Fan Moi Chau and Hongdae will play a big role in organizing this. And their idea was, well, obviously we can't just form a society in Vietnam. The French are going to crack down on that. So we need to basically establish a system for recruiting potential followers and smuggling them to Japan. The idea was to establish basically an expat community in Japan, various Vietnamese individuals who would then go through schooling in Japan. They would learn new languages, they would learn new science, engineering, they'd study politics, philosophy, all of this stuff. And it was then, from there, they could then branch out, maybe find foreign backers that might be able to do the system, because Japan had found some allies doing what done after all. Then they could create, an actual revolutionary organization, train maybe a proper army at that point, which they have financial resources. These guys had big plans. And they did effectively establish a network designed to smuggle people out of the country and into Japan. And lots went. Now, it wasn't millions, but thousands. By 1907, there were 10,000, I think, living in Japan as part of this movement. The problem with the Duong Do movement, though, was that while it had a pretty clear end goal, independence for Vietnam, the road to get there was vague at best. Like, we'll follow the Japanese model. Well, you kind of can't, because Japan wasn't ever actually colonized, and so all of their internal modernization had taken place in an independent country. That's a little different than what you're dealing with. On top of that, there was a lot of, I guess you might say, ideological differences inside the organization itself. Chau, for example, he was often kind of seen as a real voice for right-wing politics, and some have even said he had fascist leanings later on. He's definitely very much a conservative figure. He does believe in the independence of the country. He's a very strong nationalist for Vietnam, but he's also a dyed-in-the-wool monarchist. On top of this, he believes that the only way to achieve independence is immediate violent revolution. A lot of Duong Do members agreed that war would be necessary, but they thought that, maybe we need to prepare a little better first. Like, we need to kind of lay the groundwork. We can't just immediately, buy our soccer rifles and go back as a liberation brigade. That's not going to work very well. The man who sort of took the opposite approach was a man named Phan Chu Trinh, who would also be a major organizer in this, who really, he was a colleague of Chau. They got along well enough, but he thought that Chau was kind of a hot-headed fool. He felt, well, one, Trinh is a big believer in democracy. He said monarchy is an anachronism. The Vietnamese royal imperial system has become such a farce of itself, thanks to French and collaboration, that we can't revitalize that. Tear it down. Let's build a modern Vietnamese republic. And so he said, to do this, our first step is we have to educate the people. We have to have an active, educated, participating population who not only can be democratic, but also understand what it is they're actually fighting for. And that split is probably going to be one of the biggest problems the Duong Do movement faces early on. It just does not have a solid game plan or a solid roadmap to get there. In fact, Trinh will basically eventually abandon the efforts in Japan more or less and try to put his own ideas into place. In March of 1907, he goes to Hanoi, where he obtains permission to open a school. This is known as the Dong Kinh Gia Thuc. Now, this got permission because it was primarily supposed to be a language school. But that was kind of a smokescreen for its broader activities. The core of it was teaching the new alphabet, Hoc Nagu. Hoc Nagu was an attempt to create a new alphabet for Vietnam that used Roman letters rather than the Chinese characters that were classically used. And that was considered important by men like Trinh because it was easy to learn. Literacy was a matter of months of teaching, not years of learning, as it had been previously. And he was very committed to the idea that we need a literate public as a first step. And so as part of this, he establishes a school. It is free to attend. There's no tuition. There's also no entry exams, no bar. Anyone can attend. Anyone can attend. They want young, old, rich, poor, man, woman. Didn't matter who you were. If you wanted to learn, you could come to his school and you would be enrolled in classes. And they went far beyond just language training. They taught math, science, history, economics, geography, philosophy, all of it. Under the surface, there is a strong thread of essentially populism. This idea that we, the people, are the backbone of the state, that we, the people, are the ones who are going to rise up and ultimately create a new society. Now, obviously, the kind of modernization that men like Trinh are pushing is very different, in fact, almost opposed to the traditional ideas of Vietnamese society. And while the Duong Do movement had given some impetus and some resistance to that, he has taken it further. And he very famously gave a speech to his students in Hanoi, which kind of summed up, why he felt this was necessary and why he felt it was a good thing. He said, "Thousands of years ago, our people cut off their hair and tattooed themselves. Only when Chao To took over our country for the Chinese did we become infected with Chinese customs. But even then, only a few people in urban centers followed them. It was not until the Ming invaders came and compelled us to imitate them that we began to let our hair grow, and that our women began to wear trousers, and we became Chinese. But today, we have awakened, and the entire nation is modernizing. So go out and cut your hair. Don't leave any more land for that gang of parasites to colonize the top of your head, from which they can suck your blood. Wouldn't it feel wonderful to get rid of them?" Now, there's two layers here, obviously. One, he's talking about we've adopted other cultural elements for when necessary, and when he makes a humorous connection between the modern Western practice of short hair for men and the Chinese practice of the meaning of growing it long, talking about, cut your hair to get rid of your lice. Well, talking about lice colonizing your head and getting rid of the bloodsuckers is a pretty strong undercurrent of what the real goal of all these actually is. But again, it's just vague enough. It doesn't necessarily ring a red flag immediately. Though I should point out that this Dong Hin Gia Thuk school wasn't actually open for very long. By 1908, the French decide that maybe this is dangerous.
So for those of you not keeping track at home, it's open about a year, and then the French decide, let's close that down.
Now, it's not just because of that, but in April of 1908, a series of riots break out across Vietnam. These are primarily tax riots, and they are in response to the abuses of corvée labor, the ruinous taxes, the exploitative monopolistic practices. It's a series of unorganized local protests against French occupation, and as might be expected, it has been suppressed by military force, as was often the case. But it wasn't just these riots. These riots also sparked off other movements. There were, again, a number of villages across the country. Local populations would rise up and drive out local officials, sometimes attack them. And in a few famous cases, local collaborators were seized and their hair was cut. Now, we can't necessarily say that these were people who had listened to that speech and decided cutting hair became a symbolic tool of resistance, but there were certainly some among the French who thought there was a connection there. And so, in late April of 1908, the crackdown occurs. Dozens of people were killed during the suppression. Numerous others were arrested, imprisoned. Many were executed. Hundreds were deported to various overseas prison colonies. And the French then began to systematically crack down upon what they see as dangerous movements. For example, the French put immense pressure on Japan diplomatically to hand over both Phan Boi Chau and Quang Day, and the Japanese do deport them, but don't actually extradite them. So instead, the French decide to try both of them in absentia and sentence them to death. Both instead actually flee to Hong Kong and attempt to rebuild their organization there under the auspices of British protection, but they didn't really have much success. For this point, the movement was kind of in too much chaos, and they find very little in the way of support, recruits, or funds. Huang Day ends up drifting into Europe, roaming around there for a while, trying to raise awareness and support of the plight of the Vietnamese people, to little actual success, though he does become an important part of establishing Vietnamese expat communities in France and elsewhere. Phan Boi Chau actually goes to Thailand, where he, for a while, basically lives in a rural village as a rice farmer, but gets so bored with that life that in 1912 he flees back into China and ends up hooking up with fringe elements of Sun Yat-sen's Chinese Revolution. And he's very much inspired by Sun Yat-sen's ideas and his success in his Chinese Revolution, and he begins to further refine his ideas there. Although he will never really have much luck in organizing new resistance movements, he remains an important figure symbolically of that resistance. As part of the general crackdown, though, the Dong King Gia Thuk School was closed down as well, though Fan Chu Trin is able to escape too many serious consequences. By, again, 1910, the first real revitalization of resistance and nationalist movements had both failed in the exact same way the previous resistance movements had happened. They pushed a little too aggressively, and the French decided to deploy their immense military power. For about the next decade, once again, the Vietnamese approach to the problem begins to change and adapt to circumstances. In the wake of this crackdown, and a second crackdown that occurs in 1912 after a series of terrorist attacks, which are widely linked to Phan Boi Chau's organization in China, a series of figures collectively known as the Westernizers begin to emerge. And while in theory they are very similar to the Dong Day ideas of westernizing and modernizing the country, these men were often in some ways far more radical in what they felt should be done, but also far more controversial in some cases their open admiration for the French. So they are complex figures, to say the least. So what exactly are they? Are they nationalists? Are they collaborators? They're kind of both, honestly. Now, none of these men held official positions in the colonial administration. None of them were village heads. None of them were tax collectors or colonial officers. So, if they were collaborators, it was really more in their sympathies and their ideas than in their actual action. At the same time, they did talk a lot about, we need to modernize our nation in order to make it strong again. They were definitely nationalists, just in a very different way. These men almost universally agreed that tradition is not the way forward, that we cannot hold on to ancient ideas of monarchy and the mandarins, we cannot hold on to these closed village systems and networks of clients, we cannot hold on to Confucianism, we have to embrace the new age. And kind of mirroring in some way Fan Chu Trin's speech, they point out that these traditions are Chinese. They were enforced upon us by armies centuries ago, and now we call them the right and proper way to live. France is clearly stronger than that. They are the superior nation, and so we have a duty to learn from them. Thus the controversies, you might imagine. And again, it varies.
The Confucian system, in some of its own ways, had laid the groundwork for its own undermining. Ideas like the mandate of heaven. When a foreign nation like France arrives and defeats your king and then puts his brother to serve on the throne at their leisure, do you have the mandate of heaven? Who has it? Does France command it at that point? The idea of filial piety and the highly hierarchical and structured authoritarian sort of family and government systems, when they're at odds, when you have mandarins who are decrying collaboration as kings, and when you have rural elites who are working with the French and then former Confucian mandarins who are off in the countryside seclusion. You have all these factors adding up. It completely undermines it, because what structure are you supposed to go to? Are you supposed to give your obedience to the most powerful government in the region? Are you supposed to give your obedience to the monarch if they just serve France? It structures society in such a way that when these disruptions are placed in there, there's no internal response. There's no room for criticism, and the traditional structures just don't fit.
And how some of these Westernizers even used Confucian language and ideas to justify abandoning Confucianism. So again, it's a complex issue, to say the least.
The novelist Ngo Tat To in 1929 wrote, "In the past, Confucianism raised Vietnam up to the rank of a civilized nation, but Confucianism also carried Vietnam to the brink of destruction.
But regardless of how francophilic some of these individuals were, they all sort of agreed that Vietnam as it stood could not last. That the country needed to strengthen itself, reassert itself, become independent once more, essentially reclaim its dignity, which is ironic because the French were claiming they were doing by conquering regions, reclaiming their dignity. These men didn't see a lot of value in tradition. They felt that Western culture was the route forward. Now, they were fine with maintaining. They were proud of their history. They were proud of their cultural heroes. They were proud of their language. But they felt that things needed to change. Most were highly critical, again, of traditional Vietnamese culture. They pointed to they said, the lack of education in the country is the reason that we are so underdeveloped compared to the rest of the world. And this traditional system, which enforces education only in a narrow band of society, has perpetuated this cycle. Most were anti-monarch. They didn't just feel that the current monarchy was a joke. They felt that monarchy itself was an outdated and outmoded system had to go. Others had agreed, and Trinh had also agreed, even if he was more of a traditionalist in other ways. The most radical were, in some ways, though, anti-Vietnamese. Well, at least culturally, one of the most famous figures of this, Nguyen Van Vinh, who, his history is complicated. He's one of those people who actually felt a great debt to the French because he had been born in abject poverty and been taken in by missionaries and sent and educated by them at the French lycée and actually gotten a university education in France. This is a man who had felt that, French culture had lifted him up out of obscurity and poverty and suffering and actually made him an educated and well-to-do man, even if he wasn't actually a member of their administration. And he saw, in some ways, the poverty and the backwardness and the ignorance and the lack of development in Vietnam as sort of proof that his nation was inferior in some ways. Though, by the standards of the time, he actually had a surprisingly progressive idea. I mean, today we call that problematic. Some might even call it racist, the idea of the inferiority of Asian cultures is kind of part of the European ideologies at this time. But he said, we are inferior to the West for cultural, not racial reasons. Culture is the variable that best explains the difference between peoples of the world, and that can be changed. So in many ways, his position is nuanced in that he's not saying, we're not inferior because we're Vietnamese, we're inferior because our culture has held us back, and if we form our culture, then we can become powerful. And he's a controversial figure at the best of times, though in some ways he's kind of clever, because he and other men like him, because of their pro-French status, because very few of them preached active resistance. Most, in fact, preached acceptance of French occupation as a means of westernizing the country. Thus, they were able to get away with publishing their articles and papers and books because French colonial authorities were like, yes, these are clearly enlightened Vietnamese people who see the benefits of French culture, even if they were sort of trying to lay the groundwork to get rid of the French in some ways. Among the westernizers, there are a few key figures, Trong Dinh Hy and Hung Tin Hoa. Again, I apologize for mispronouncing those names. These men would lay the groundwork for a lot of this by attempting to sort of continue the work of the Dong Kinh Gia Thuc school by popularizing the new Hoc Ngu language, the idea of trying to figure out how to popularize this new alphabet and spread literacy. They struck upon the idea of publishing newspapers in this language. The French were establishing very fledgling colonial school systems at this time, and there was some attempts to convince them to adopt this new Hoc Ngu alphabet as the standard teaching in the school. They chose to teach French instead for obvious reasons. Working with a French publisher, Henry Schneider, eventually established a newspaper in Hanoi called the Indochina Journal, which is one of the first Vietnamese language newspapers in the country. Now, this newspaper, since being official permission from the colonial government to be printed, and only really got it because technically a Frenchman owned it, had to be very careful in how it actually framed its bait. And in fact, for the most part, it was. It denounced the Dong Day movement. It particularly denounced Chow and his suspected terrorist activities, especially the suspected attempt in 1912 to assassinate Governor General Surratt. Nonetheless, the paper was at least partly successful in its goals. The reading public was relatively small, but by publishing articles about culture, about the world, about news, but also translating books, both traditional Chinese and Vietnamese classics, as well as Western books. They essentially created an audience. People, especially in the cities, were eager to learn, and suddenly there now were a vehicle to do this. And thus, using this as a start, they were able to slowly begin working more openly political documents, ideas into paper. And Nguyen Van Dinh, the Francophile who I mentioned, goes to work for this paper relatively early on. And while he was very loud in his denunciation of violent revolution, in fact, he felt that violent revolution was perhaps one of the least effective means of resistance at this point. Although he had an interesting justification for this. He didn't say this openly in his paper, but through private letters and things like this, he basically argued that if we begin to arm ourselves, assassinate French officials and the like, all we're doing is validating the racist European ideas of the yellow peril. So we need to build a different groundwork first. So there's a certain degree of practicality underneath his, at times, unusual cultural and political stance. Nonetheless, over the course of his career, he is going to publish numerous, dozens, even hundreds of articles in the Indochina Journal and elsewhere. Some of it is poetry. He was, like many Vietnamese authors of this era, a poet. But he also snuck in a lot of his criticism of traditional Vietnamese culture. And a lot of these are, in his own words, attempts to teach the people to see themselves as the French do. Now, his goal there is twofold. Partly to kind of underline why he feels certain traditions need to be removed and why superior Western traditions should replace them. But in theory, he's also trying to teach people how to deal with French. It's like, this is how the French are going to interpret traditional things that we do and things that we say, and this is why it might not go the way you think it's going to go. Again, to go back to Mr. Jameson, my favorite author on this period, he worked as an interpreter in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and he talked about even then there were a lot of cultural barriers between Vietnamese and American culture that led to all kinds of misunderstandings that he tried to deal with, but just couldn't because it's just too deeply ingrained. So one could argue that Dinh is trying to do something similar, trying to teach the people that this is how you deal with foreigners. Through this, though, he also tries to introduce many literary classics, mostly French literary classics like the Three Musketeers, but also publishes a lot of works on the Enlightenment, Voltaire and Diderot and Rousseau and other seminal figures of the French Revolution. It's fascinating that the French often didn't see a problem with French revolutionary literature being published in their colonial empire. I guess they thought it's French, so it must be fine, even though you'd think I just can't quite grasp why no French authorities were that worried that French revolutionary literature was being circulated in the colonies, but there you go, nonetheless. While Dinh was one of the most prolific writers of this movement, there were plenty of others who were more openly political in what they did. They produced articles on what does it mean to be a citizen, not a subject, a citizen. That's an important distinction. What does it mean to be a responsible citizen? They produced articles that laid bare some of the just almost unbelievable webs of corruption that were growing both in the court of play and among the French colonial government. They brought to light, again, some of the most blatant social exploitative practices. They talked about social and cultural reforms. They championed education, the need for an educated voting public, and the needs of literacy in a modern society. They were immensely critical of what they called the closed village system, this idea that the villages are almost semi-autonomous networks, essentially feudal networks of a village headman and his clients, their powerful families, and how these were little islands unto themselves that kind of resisted influence from the outside world, and that you can't live like that in the modern state. People have to be aware of what's going on around them, not just what's happening with the local official you're quarreling with, but how that local official is part of a huge network and hierarchy of people that stretches the whole world, and that things that are happening in London might affect you because of that.
Nguyen Van Huyen wrote, "The peasant elite, the village notables, are opposed to all true and deep reform. These are people who have paid for 20, 30, and 40 years to attain their social status. They are an age when one can quietly cross one's legs on the den's best mats to eat and to drink, or knowledgeably to appreciate the way in which young people serve them what they eat and drink. If anyone tries to push through any kind of reform whatsoever, he inevitably attracts merciless spite. Someone puts opium under his roof, or on some contraband alcohol in his pigsty or his stable, and 9 times out of 10, the framed man is condemned.
In a very real sense, they were an early democratic national group, even if they were a very pro-Western group at the same time. And among the emerging middle class of Hanoi and Saigon, of merchants and students and professionals, often who were educated, who could read, they began to create the seeds, if you will, of, well, class consciousness, the future seeds of what would become the political parties and resistance organizations of the later 20th century. Now, that's not to say all the Westernizers were equally enthusiastic about Westernization, though. Special note needs to be taken of one of them, a man named Phan Quan, who would actually go on to be Prime Minister of the country under Bao Dai in a couple of decades. The irony is not lost on me. He, however, was a little less enthusiastic about all this embracing of Western ideas. Now, he was equally agreed that tradition was no longer sufficient, but that wasn't because he disagreed with it, it was because he recognized reality. In fact, he was deeply socially conservative in some ways and spoke of trying to maintain as many traditions possible. But at the same time, he also agreed that we can't simply live as our ancestors did. He agreed that Westernization was necessary to a point if the country was to survive, but he wasn't happy about it. He was willing to accept French occupation and control of the country, not because he admired French culture, but because he thought that France would be a useful shield against Japan and China, who might have ambitions in the region. In fact, he even sort of, at times, talked about, maybe we should keep things like the monarchy around. Now, one might imagine he envisioned the monarchy somewhat differently than others in the past had done, but he's about the closest we get to a social conservative among the Westernizers. He sees reform as a vehicle to strengthen the country, like the others do, but he sees that strength as being necessary to maintain as much tradition as possible. So he's very much of the Wang-Day school of thinking in that regard. Nonetheless, despite all of this, these men were widely read, and they were hugely influential, even if they weren't always popular. However, what none of them could predict is that when they are writing some of their seminal articles about Westernization and tradition and ideas, they're doing it around 1914. And things are about to happen in the world in 1914, which changes the equation in a way that really no one could have predicted. So as most of you are probably aware, in 1914, the First World War breaks out because an Austrian archduke got assassinated. And that brought a whole chain of dominoes falling, which ended up embroiling pretty much the entirety of Europe in a war.
Multi-kill.
There's other series who cover that war in far more detail in Europe, but we're concerned about how does that war affect Vietnam and French occupation of it. Now, unlike the Second World War, which really was a global war fought on almost every continent, to some degree, fighting is mostly contained to Western and Eastern Europe, a little bit of naval warfare in the Atlantic, and Japan quietly taking over what German colonies there were in Asia.
And the Africa, East Africa campaign.
Vietnam itself is never directly attacked, it's never directly threatened, there's no concern that anyone might come and land troops there. The war is very distant for most people living there. But, as France did with almost all of its colonies, the resources of Vietnam will be put toward the war effort in Europe. According to French records, about 100,000 Vietnamese were drafted for service to some degree in the French army. Most of these were laborers being put to work in factories or building roads or driving trucks, but at least 4 battalions saw direct combat service at Picardy and the Somme. And there's also a not entirely documented number of Vietnamese troops who did some fighting in the Balkans as well. So it wasn't just labor forces. common policy that the French used. They had Algerian troops as well. A bunch of different colonial troops fought in the Western Front and the Eastern Front a little bit as well.
As I mentioned last one, Africa was primarily the army center of the French Empire, and Vietnam was the navy center. So for a trench war, they called a lot more on the Algerians and spent a lot more of their blood than they did the Vietnamese.
But in Vietnam itself was still called upon other ways. Millions of piastres of currency were extracted to fund the war effort, and huge amounts of rice were exported to essentially help feed the army. In fact, so much food was exported from Vietnam for French use that it actually caused a famine in the country, which was actually kind of a long time coming. The population of Vietnam had been growing pretty significantly in the 20th century. The truly ruinsome tax rates they were being charged, as well as these added massive exports, were creating significant shortages.
A 1929 prediction was that the Red River Delta could only feed 5.2 million people. At that time, it was already at 7 million. In addition, at the time it was believed that fertile women averaged about 5 children apiece. Though, Vietnam being fairly poor and unequal and not reached by most of the benefits that the French settlers themselves had, health and sanitation were still pretty poor and child mortality remained quite high. Nearly 1 out of every 2 died by the age of 5 in areas of Hanoi and South Annam.
It was the brutal fighting in the trenches and the terrible conditions there that really had the two effects on the Vietnamese troops that served in the battlefields. One, it helped to thoroughly puncture any illusion of European superiority culturally or politically to see these just horrendous slaughters occurring. But it also served in a grim way as a very effective way to expose these people to the outside world in a way that decades of newspaper articles and books had not been able to. The veterans of the First World War that returned to Vietnam, having experienced this, are going to be highly politicized as a result of this, and they are going to be the core of the new nationalist movements that will emerge in the post-war years. It's not just that, though. There were some individuals inside of Vietnam who felt that now was the time. France was clearly bogged down in a massive war in Europe. The thought that any kind of reinforcements would arrive in a timely fashion seemed pretty distant, and there were those who felt that the time for revolution has come now. If we rise up now, they can't stop it. I guess maybe some of them thought they might lose the war. Turn to France lost the war on top of that, well, that would even further entrench their position, but they didn't know that. And as a result of this kind of thinking, there were 2 major revolts that occurred in Vietnam as a result of this. The first is known generally as the Cochinchina Revolt, which occurs in the year 1916. It's not really a unified revolt. It's actually about 3 or 4 different riots, revolts, and uprisings that occur at around the same time in and around Saigon. It's a combination of things. Protests against famine and taxation and just general malaise against current conditions. But there were a few specific groups involved. One particularly large group involved in this were the followers of a man called Phan Zik Long. He was what's called a geomancer, which basically means he practiced feng shui. And he claimed to be a member of the Vietnamese royal family, and that through his magical powers, he would be able to restore the country and the monarchy. I should point out that he had actually been arrested years earlier as a result of attempting to take over the country with a magic potion, and I am not making that up, it's actually what he did. And he was in prison, as you might imagine, and had been for years, but he still had followers. And they're among those who agitate and attempt to break him out of prison during the Cochinchina uprising. There are also a wide variety of what are collectively called Mekong secret societies involved. These are a bunch of different people. Some are weird religious cults. Some are essentially organized criminal organizations. Others are underground nationalist groups. A number of these had actually thrown their support behind Long's followers in an attempt to bust him out of prison, and they attempted to storm the Saigon prison and didn't get very far, because by most accounts they were armed with knives and sharpened sticks, and the French garrison was armed with rifles and machine guns. But the fact that so many different groups across the Mekong had risen up at the same time, not just Long's, but others as well, had really kind of spooked the French. And it was only the fact that these were not well coordinated, well armed, well led, or well planned that led them to be suppressed as quickly as they were. But that would not be the most dangerous. Next year, 1917, another uprising called the Tai Nguyen Uprising occurs. This happens at the Tai Nguyen prison, which was a major prison facility where a large number of political prisoners were kept by French authorities. The capstone of a large network of such facilities in Vietnam.
The police in the Indochina region were actually notable for their excesses. Abuses, torture, violence, not uncommon. The area has actually been directly compared to an outright police state. The rate of imprisonment was actually 2 to 3 times neighboring areas like the Dutch Indies and Japan. It was 160 times the rate of France's imprisonment. Police, prison, and surveillance actually took up quite a substantial portion of the national budget. It was 19% of Tonkin's budget and was 16% of Cochin China's budget.
Now, the Tai Nguyen prison is unique, however, in that the vast majority of guards there were mostly drawn from local militias. They weren't French officials. Now, they had French police and troops on site, and there was a French commissioner of the prisons, but the majority of the manpower there were colonial troops. And by most accounts, it was kind of a dead-end posting. The pay wasn't very good. Corruption was pretty common. It was very lax security here. And what ended up happening was that a group of about 200 political prisoners at Tai Nguyen are able to convince a number of their guards to help them escape and seize control of the prison.
Specifically, they were supposed to be aided by about 130 guards and about 300 civilians, including miners, fishermen, and bandits.
It was quite a little group, and political prisoners were able to convince these various people that they would be the key signal for a nationalist uprising across the country, and that China, which had so recently thrown off its foreign domination, would certainly come in support of them and send troops to aid them. And so, either out of just anger at the system, hope for a revolution, or just a willingness to say, screw it to the French, these people rose up and seized control of the prison, took control of the armories, armed themselves, and dug in, waiting for the Chinese. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited. I'm not even sure that the Chinese government in Beijing even knew this was happening, much less was ready to support it. Even if they had been willing, I don't think they could have done it that quickly. It was kind of weirdly optimistic. But nonetheless, when the French did send military force to take the prison back, the resistance was fierce, and by some accounts they shelled it for 5 days before the various revolutionaries at last either died, gave up, or fled into the mountains. And the French government spared no expense in hunting these people down.
Prior to that, they'd actually controlled the city and the prison for 6 months.
Official French records claim that only 5 escaped justice, but one can hardly expect the French to admit that large numbers of their own employees had escaped after an uprising like this. While these 2 uprisings during the First World War were unsuccessful, it was kind of the spark to reignite the hope of armed resistance once again in Vietnam, and despite the crackdowns that would follow, that ember wouldn't go out. However, perhaps even more significantly for the future, it's around the end of the First World War that we see the emergence probably of the most significant political leader in Vietnam in the 20th century, known to most of the world as Ho Chi Minh, born Nguyen Sinh Cung, who in 1919-1920 would begin to emerge not just as a voice for Vietnamese nationalism, but also as a voice for Vietnamese revolution. Now, I think most Americans who are even passingly familiar with the Vietnam War have heard the name Ho Chi Minh, and even today his name survives, like Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, for example. And many would know him as the leader of the North Vietnam and the Vietnamese communists, but this man actually had quite an interesting career himself. He was born in the year 1890, or 1891, or 1892, or 1894, or 95, or 96, he claimed all of those. And he was born Nguyen Sinh Cung, we think. We guess that he had up to 200 different names during his life, so there's some debate over exactly when he was born and what his parents named him.
To be fair, apparently that was a somewhat common thing among some Marxist leaders, just keep going through names. Stalin apparently only stuck with Stalin because that was the name of his most sort of popular writing that people identified him by, so that's the one he stuck with.
And the name Ho Chi Minh, which he adopts later, actually has a pretty significant meaning. It roughly means in Vietnamese, he who has been enlightened. And he adopted that after his open conversion to communism, so there's a pretty strong undercurrent there as well. This is what we know of the man. He was the son of a Mandarin known as Nguyen Sin Sak, a Confucian scholar of very high regard, who had also been dismissed from imperial service before the French arrived for excess brutality. He apparently had a man beaten almost to death for a relatively minor offense, and he got a black mark on his record for that. But when the French showed up, Nguyen Sin Sak is like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. And he was one of those mandarins who chose to go into seclusion and live in dignified poverty rather than debase his position by supporting the French. It's telling to note that many of the major leaders of the Vietnamese communists, Ho Chi Minh, Pham Van Dong, Vo Nguyen Giap, all come from Mandarin families that did that. So one can sort of understand their popularity in that light. Despite his father's clear anti-French stance, the young Ho Chi Minh was very well educated. He was by all accounts extremely intelligent. His father trained him in Chinese and Confucian classics, but also enrolled him at the so-called French Lycée in Hue, which is a school that basically trained French translators, and in theory was a school for future administrators, though he opted for that route. And again, a lot of famous future Vietnamese political figures attended the Lycée, not just his colleagues, Pham Van Dong and Giap, but also the future president of South Vietnam, the Ngo Dinh Diem, will attend that school. It's a pretty big deal. Now, unfortunately, much of his early life is poorly documented at best, largely because not a lot of records survive, not many were taken, some we have access to. He rewrote his own history a couple of times, as a lot of political leaders do, so a lot of it is guesswork. Like, for example, he claimed that he was involved in the 1908 riots, anti-corvée riots, and that was the moment in which his course was set to dedicate his life to the independence of Vietnam. The problem is with that is that the riot occurred 8 months before he was admitted to the Lycée. Either his involvement was very secret, or he wasn't really involved. Although the idea that he was inspired by it does make some sense. He also listened to several speeches by Phan Boi Chau, so again, he was a man who was involved in these sorts of things. He graduates from the Lycée and does rather well for himself, but in June of 1911, he decides to leave Vietnam. He signs on as a cook on a ship and sets off for France, which he lands in France in July of that year. There he applies to attend called the French Colonial Administrative School, but his application was rejected. And again, it's kind of interesting because that's a school that's pretty much attended by Vietnamese who intend to serve some kind of role in the French colonial government. What exactly his goals and plans with that were, we don't know. He never commented on it. A generous individual would say he was trying to gain insight into the French administration. A less generous individual would say he was an opportunist. It's impossible to say, and the man himself is long dead. But nonetheless, his rejection from this school spurs him to become a world traveler for a little while. And this is, again, another relatively poorly documented period of his life. In 1912, he's in New York, the United States. We know this from a few letters and postcards that exist with the appropriate postmarks. He claims to have worked a number of odd jobs while in the U.S., but almost no proof exists for any of this. For example, he claimed that he was a line manager for General Motors. There is no employment record for him there, although he could have used a false name. He also claimed to work for the Parker House Hotel, which also has no record of his employment. But again, with 200 different names, it's hard to say. During his time in New York, he came into contact with Korean nationalists who were agitating for independence against Japan. He also was apparently quite taken with Harlem culture, and was also a fan of the writings of Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist. In 1913, he leaves the United States and goes to Great Britain, where he lives for the next 6 years. And again, working a similar pattern of odd jobs with very little actual documentation of what he was doing. But in 1919, he returns to France. Maybe. He claims he went there in 1917, but the actual passport records say 1919. Hard to say. While he is there, he meets up with a group of Vietnamese expats known as the Group of Vietnamese Patriots. The name is a little more poetic than Vietnamese. And these individuals had been writing for years, producing articles in a small paper being published in France, basically trying to draw attention to the plight of Vietnam, the suffering of the Vietnamese people, agitating for independence. And he very quickly fell in with this group, and through a combination of his charisma, his grasp of languages, by some accounts he spoke 8 different languages, French, English, Russian, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, and Esperanto of all things.
What is Esperanto?
It's a made-up language that actually does exist, but it was created to be a universal human language. And it's like the most famous thing ever was in a movie starring William Shatner in Esperanto.
Sweet.
But these articles had largely been published under a pseudonym, all of them, Nguyen the Patriot, which is the name that Ho Chi Minh himself adopted for a time. But at this point, the World War I is over, and the Allies are basically involved in the torturous negotiations for the Versailles Treaty, which that's a whole other kettle of fish of competing national interests and lack of really clear image of what they wanted out of it. But one of the big figures there, of course, is the American President Woodrow Wilson, who, for all of his many faults, nonetheless brought with him his so-called 14 points, which he talked about the dismantling of empires and the self-determination of peoples. Very high-handed rhetoric that to Ho Chi Minh and the other Vietnamese patriots felt this was a man who might actually be willing to listen. This is a man who might actually be championing ideas that we can agree with. And so, again, because he could speak English and French pretty fluently, Ho Chi Minh was sort of the representative of this group. He was sent to Versailles, along with various letters of introduction and manifestos to try and convince the great powers to support independence of Vietnam and presumably other colonial countries. He was never given any audience to anyone, and as far as we know, none of his letters were ever actually read. There are some historians who have called this a great missed opportunity in world history, and that may be true, but the reality is the Versailles Conference was an incredibly contentious event, to say the least. The Triple Entente, as it was properly called, had no real unifying motives what they wanted for peace. Wilson has this very idealistic vision of the future, which is incomplete at best. Britain kind of wants a return to status quo. France wants retribution from Germany. And nobody really has a clear vision of what the future should look like. And so the idea that they would entertain what are essentially a small group of literary nobodies. I mean, Ho Chi Minh was even less than that. He was a world traveler and vagabond, really, up to that point. The idea that they'd be granted entrance to anyone like, Lloyd George or Clemenceau or Wilson would see them is a little bit naive. It became pretty obvious, though, that for all the idea of self-determination of 14 points, that Wilson was a pretty classic American racist in this regard, that he meant self-determination for the white people of Eastern Europe from the empires of Austria and Germany, not for the rest of the people of the world.
That's an interesting thing is the Vietnamese weren't the only ones there. There were actually a number of minority groups who did go to Versailles seeking some form of recognition or some sort of status in the treaty or some sort of place in this post-war era. Combine that with, say, the pan-Arab state that was promised Lawrence of Arabia and various other things like that. Versailles ended up being, for all the pretension, for all the things Wilson and the others said it would be, that ended up just becoming sort of this gloss and sort of this justification for what was really just carving up the world for the victors. And interestingly enough, it wasn't just for the Entente, it was just for certain members of the Entente. Russia, which had been a member at the beginning, essentially was treated like one that defeated. Various parts of its constituent empire were carved off to become various new states. And Wilson himself, who was so obsessed with the sort of New World Order and so obsessed with this idea of the League of Nations, instead becomes so paranoid and so wrapped up in the Allied intervention when the Russian Revolution happened, so involved in trying to squash the influence of the Bolsheviks outside Russia, and so wrapped up in not allowing communism to have any sort of presence in America that he poisoned the idea of internationalism, sowed fear among the American population of cooperating with the outside world because of opening itself to these outside dangerous ideas like Marxism. The whole Versailles 14-point plan became this sort of fetid icing on a terrible cake that would lead to the horrors of the second half of the century.
Well, after the disappointment of the Versailles Conference, Ho Chi Minh would become drawn into left-wing French politics, joining the French Socialist Party. And in 1920, would vote with various other members to become one of the founders of the French Communist Party. Now, some have claimed that that's because the French Communists were the only ones who were actually, in their support of Lenin and the Third International, the only ones who were actually in favor of colonial independence, though through his writings and speeches, it was very clear that Ho Chi Minh was Marxist-leaning for some time before this. Attempts to rally support for colonial issues among left-wing French politicians proved to be kind of a dead issue. Despite some rhetorical discussion of it, despite some theoretical talk of it. In the end, French nationalism remained too big of an issue across the spectrum of France, and maintaining the dignity and power of the French Empire became too much of an issue, and in 1923 he decides to leave France and travels to the Soviet Union, theoretically to attend the University for the Toilers of the East there. And it's at that point in which his political career will take a very significant shift.
To understand the University of the Toilers of the East, we have to look a little bit more at this overarching organization which it was cooperating with, the Comintern, or Communist International, or the Third Internationale. The Internationals were things initially established in prior decades to facilitate cooperation between the leftist movements and leftist political parties scattered throughout multiple nations, essentially movements like the Social Democrats, the Democratic Socialists, the Marxists, the Anarchists, the Syndicalists, all these various groups who essentially put themselves apart from traditional conservative and liberal, apart from the traditional reactionary monarchist sects. These individuals who had a somewhat common aim, these groups began to coalesce. However, disputes between them led to these divisions, and initially the First and Second Internationals were racked infighting between the socialists and the anarchists, the so-called black and red split. The actual Second International, however, was more or less put to death by the First World War. The period of leftist movements is racked by infighting. You see the Social Democrats and other sort of reformist, moderate groups feuding with the revolutionaries. In fact, this is not unlike what we saw in Vietnam when we're talking about the constitutionalist reformists and their disagreements with Fanboy Chow and the other reactionary movements. And the problem is, when you look at World War I, when you see these splits where the majority of socialist parties and the vast majority of social democratic parties and groups like those are actually abandoning their priorly held principles of being anti-war to support World War I, to support more or less the most nakedly political, the most pointless and barbaric of wars ever fought. If there was ever going to be a war that the various anarchists and socialists and leftist movements stood up and said, let's not participate, it would have been the First World War. And yet that was the war that dragged all these movements with it. All these movements got wrapped up in the nationalistic, militaristic tide of jingoism, the romantic idea of this war to end all wars and to fight the aggressive Hun Germany and all that. It was so dramatic that the actual more hardcore leftist movements, the ones who were already more naturally tending toward revolution, the ones who believed that the current system was so calcified and ossified that there would be no moving it through political debate, no moving it through votes. They were the ones who said, no, we will not stand up for the just butchery of the trenches, of just the entire senselessness of 1914. And so you had this break. You had groups like the Spartacus League in Germany and Debs in the US who broke from that. Instead were these more radical groups who refused the call. Found a home was eventually after the Russian Revolution in the Third Internationale. The idea of world revolution as espoused by the Soviet Union looked a whole lot more inevitable when your fellow leftists were going along with this pointless war and immediately condemning the Bolsheviks. It was an interesting thing. Lenin himself criticized these social pacifists for having anti-war rhetoric and yet voting for it. The idea of revolutionary defeatism is something they espouse. The idea is that true leftists, the ones who could not believe that this was happening, that their fellows were being wrapped up in such a pointless struggle, was the idea that you should accelerate toward this goal by pushing for your country to lose the war. The idea is that through loss and through showing the pointlessness of this and actually throwing away all this money and lives for nothing, it would help finally break the spell and the enchantment of being wrapped up in this hugely jingoistic facade. So after the formation of the Russian communist state, the Bolshevik government, which would become USSR, they instituted themselves as sort of the leaders and the sponsors of the Third Internationale, the home of this anti-war, world revolution collective of mostly communists, but also socialists and radical movements. And this Comintern, while it would serve as sort of one of the political arms of Russia as it was a pariah state as the Soviet Union, it also had the express purpose of training these various organizers and politicians and cadre leaders to be sort of the leaders of some future world revolution. The first Congress was held during the Russian Civil War while it was still going on, and shortly after the murder of the Spartacus leaders by the Freikorps militants in Germany. 34 parties from across the world attended. During the Second Congress, Lenin issued the 21 Conditions, and this was the document that was a clear break between the former groups and that of the extreme parties. It denounced the legality and the authority of so-called bourgeoisie governments. In these points, specifically Lenin deals with colonialism and the status of colonized peoples in point 8. In that one, he believed that colonies were just simply too industrialized to actually defeat their governments. They were not going to achieve true Marxism or true independence on their own, and he instead advocated that these various leftist Marxist groups should collaborate with whatever revolutionary movements, even bourgeoisie revolutionary movements in the colonies in order to undermine the greater governments. This point, however, was opposed by some of the other individuals who were from those areas. Figures like Ibn Roy, who is a founder of the Mexican Communist Party and influential in the Indian Communist Party. Eventually, these disputes over how colonialism and decolonialism and revolt in the developing world should be handled led to a sort of rewording of the document, more or less the continued policy of the colonialized world where Britain and France and the European powers had so much influence and money invested would be a perfect place in order to undermine their empires. So, from 1921 until 1938, the Communist University of the Toilers of the East operated under the auspices of the Soviet education system. As a wing of the Comintern, it trained various cadres for revolution in the colonized world. There was also an international Lenin school, which did the same for European students and those from the Americas. Both were sort of sister programs intended to spread their ideology and their people across the world who would support this sort of growing revolutionary movement, which in the ideology of the early Soviet Union, the later Trotskyist movement, was that as these revolutions occurred, as it spread, they would link up and become this sort of coalescing one ideological foundation to unite them in their common struggle. In 1928, the Japanese Foreign Ministry estimated this was currently training 1,000 students, 400 of which were supposedly Chinese. Kyuichi Tokuda of the Japanese Communist Party would actually send students to study there. Since 1923, the term of study was 3 years. The curriculum was of general education. The main branches were of party work and political education, trade union movement, economics, administrative, and legal. The students underwent military training in summer camps. As well, they conducted research work. In 1927, a research association was established to study the socio-economic problems of the Soviet and foreign East and national and colonial problems. In all, this was more or less a multinational university, have to train people for the intricacies and the higher level understandings of the current up-to-date Soviet understanding Marxism and communist ideology, and also to give them the tools and the training they might need to do the work the Soviets thought would carry them to the same sort of revolution that had taken them to power.
Ho Chi Minh attended this school for about 2 years. In 1925, officially recognized as an agent of the Comintern, he was dispatched to Canton in China to assist in organizing communist groups there. For the next 5 years, while operating in southern China, he will draw to him a wide collection of various communist, socialist, and proto-communist groups into a single organization called the Indochina Communist Party, which officially takes this name in 1930. The ICP, as it is usually referred to, will then go on to be one of the major movers and shakers in future Vietnamese politics, as one might imagine. Now, the post-war period in Vietnam is actually a relatively interesting one. After the end of the war and after the rankling over the Versailles Treaty, France, of course, like Great Britain, was committed to maintaining the integrity of its colonial empire. In something of a bit of cyclical logic, great powers have empires. Empires make you a great power. Therefore, it's kind of a self-sustaining philosophy that even though, as we said, the actual benefits of them were relatively slim for the government, the symbolism was super important.
One of the few benefits, and England makes a big stink about this at the end of World War II, is the ability for these European powers to have significant parts of the globe, essentially satellite bases that control the resources in very strategic locations. So France wanted to hold on to that while also giving away all the little bits Germany had acquired.
Now, the thing is, in the post-war period, France actually really doubles down upon investment in the region. In fact, by some accounts, their investment in both economic development and infrastructure increases by some 600%. This is the great age of booming creation of coffee, sugar, tea, especially rubber plantations. Rubber is in hugely high demand in the sort of post-war automotive boom that occurs.
This is the period in which silver is outperforming gold somewhat, so the franc is low and the piastre is high.
In addition to this, you also see coal and tin mining increase by a significant margin, and this is also when you begin to see some small degree of local manufacturing begin to emerge. But it's important to understand that, again, all of this really was going into feeding post-war French economic recovery. This was not intended to develop or improve or enrich Vietnam in any way. It was all meant to support France's post-war recovery. And so despite this 600% increase in investment in infrastructure, the practical benefits were virtually non-existent as far as the Vietnamese were concerned. In fact, it's estimated that 3 French economic syndicates controlled 90% of the Vietnamese economy. As a result of this, you begin to see a sort of shift emerge in Vietnamese society. It's at this point, largely thanks to the growing administration and growing economic apparatus of the French colonies, that you can begin to see what looks like identifiable middle class of managers and professionals and educated individuals in cities. You can begin to see something of a proto-working class beginning to emerge on the farms and factories and ports. And there's a growing sense of consciousness of these groups being groups. They're not exactly classes we would think of for the most part, but the awareness is there. Literacy is also exploding among the middle class in this period. The popularity of newspapers, novels, and even movies has begun to emerge in larger and larger amounts. And there's a lot of anger and resentment building up over French exploitation and the increasing rapacious demand of the French economy in this period. And both the literate public became increasingly aware and be able to increasingly discuss through this sort of literary culture that had been created in previous periods just how bad colonial realities actually were. Even pro-French Westernizers were increasingly critical of French policies, talking about the cultural disparities, the glass ceilings that existed, the fact that, to put it in a very blunt manner, in, say, for example, the University of Hanoi, the French janitor made more than any Vietnamese professor.
In any of these urban centers, there was a very clear divide in all these new European-style buildings and construction projects. That was designed for the actual leaders of the administration and the wealthy investors and the high-level civil servants and whatnot. And in these urban areas, there were usually an intermediate area with some luxuries, usually reserved for the mandarins and some of the lower-class French who still worked there in some sort of functionary position. And then there were the masses of straw huts rife with unsanitary conditions, poor health, malnutrition. In the urban areas where people were not subject to these rural elites, when they went to these areas, the centers of so-called civilization and westernization, it was clearly on display the complete inequality in the system. The Indochina colony actually tracked a number of individuals from France to go to the colony, largely because of higher wages as well as benefits. There was an anecdote I read in one of the texts where a man was explaining to a doctor about to go to Saigon about, you're going to need a butler for this and a staff for that, and you'll need a servant for this task, and blah, blah, blah. And by the end, the doctor asked, well, what was your profession in Indochina? And the man responded, I was a barber. And it may be apocryphal, but the idea of going there and getting so much more wealth, as well as the idea of probably living in a society where the piastre was devalued and the franc was probably going to go a lot farther. As a person from France, bringing the money you had in France, it was probably going to amount to a lot more in addition to higher salaries regardless. The administration was highly divided. It was highly racialized. The leaders and governors and district administrators were all French. The mid-level positions were mostly French, with some Vietnamese from the former Mandarin class often serving under them. In some rare cases getting to a somewhat moderate position. There was, if not widespread, at least somewhat commonplace retaliation and physical violence that occurred between the French and the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese were on the receiving end of this, had very little course of action. If they responded, they would receive harsher sentences. If they pursued legal ends, the offender would very likely suffer very little or no punishment. In fact, there was a 1930s push, unsuccessfully, to reform the courts to give the same verdict regardless of the person's ethnicity for the same crime. All of this was occurring while European propaganda continued, as we talked before, with the sort of white man's burden style propaganda of infantilizing the Vietnamese, saying that it was necessary to have the colonial administration make the decisions, saying they were incapable of running their own country, that sort of thing. The racial tension also continued in that some other Asian groups made their homes among the Vietnamese, and in fact, one of the groups was the Chinese, who had links there since mostly in the city of Cholan, next to Saigon, essentially the Chinese district of Saigon, which had been there since the Dai Viet period. Chinese merchants often had a great amount of power, controlled a decent number of the exports. Cholan also was one of the only areas, perhaps the only urban area, not to have that major class divide. It was much more on the same level. In fact, a lot of these sort of middle class jobs and positions in society were held by the Chinese, who kind of inherently were able to step above the Vietnamese peasants. But there were also the French individuals from India who came to the colony, and mostly settled in the southern areas of Cochin China, were somewhat influential on the limited but present legislative body with its limited suffrage.
Now, some of you might be wondering, French India? I thought India was a British colony. Well, you'd be right, but it's a little more complicated than that. Various European powers have been in India since the 1400s, with the Portuguese arrival in 1498. But by the 16th century, the two big powers influencing commerce and colonial policy in that region were the British and the French, under the auspices of the British East India Company and the French East India Company, both of which had fought various both military, political, and economic clashes over the years. But in 1756, an event called the 7 Years' War takes place, known as the French and Indian War in America and the Glorious War for Empire in Britain, giving some hint as to who won it. But this war, which does last until 1763, sees the British East India Company victorious. In fact, one of the decisive battles of that campaign in India was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. While the fighting will continue on until the end of the war, when the Treaty of Paris, because of course the Treaty of Paris, is signed in 1763, ending the war, India was basically awarded to the British as one of their main colonial possessions and seen as one of the crown jewels of their empire ever since. But perhaps the desire to keep the situation more stable, or perhaps simply as a way to lower tensions after the war, some concessions were made to the French. After all, in addition to India, the French also lost their North American possessions and most of their Caribbean possessions as well. In the treaty, France was allowed to maintain a number of outposts and enclaves in India that were still technically part of their empire. The major ones being Pondicherry, Karakal, Yanaon, Mahe, and Chandernagore. But theoretically, under the terms of the treaty, these were still French colonial possessions, part of the French Empire, or at least administered by the French East India Company. But in reality, this independence was kind of just sort of a political fiction. The French were allowed to administer these territories, but they were not allowed to establish any serious military presence. They were not allowed to enact any real policies affecting outside those borders, and they were required by treaty to support the efforts of the British and to support British India. In a lot of ways, one might just call it a face-saving gesture. And in reality, while these enclaves remained a part of the French Empire for quite some time, they weren't terribly profitable. In 1769, the French East India Company went bankrupt and the Crown absorbed all of their assets and continued to administer these enclaves as direct French possessions. While the value of these enclaves remained high theoretically, there were still plenty of materials like tea and silk and spices that were of value to trade, opium as well, compared to the massive, organized British colonization, compared to the sheer economic control that the British East India Company, like the British Raj, exercised, French possessions were really not worth that much. But, much like so much else in French colonial policy in the late 18th and early 19th century, a sense of national pride and a sense of trying to maintain France's power around the globe inspired them to keep it. These enclaves would remain part of France theoretically until 1947, when it was agreed they should be handed over to the newly established Republic of India, though various negotiations and referendums were held until 1954, when it was agreed to hand them over. Though, as a little aside, the French government drug its feet until 1962 before finally ratifying that treaty, but that is another story.
Though the Vietnamese had increasing tension with these groups, a lot of nationalist groups and middle class groups envied the Chinese position in their society and believed it was unjust the Chinese were essentially capitalizing some of these high paying jobs and middle class style positions while they could do it. And as well, there were reports where an Indian was supposedly appointed to an administrator position, and the Vietnamese complained that it was alright if a Frenchman, a white man, came to rule them, but they were not going to accept an Indian colored man being given the position of authority over them.
Even relatively pro-French publications like the Independent Journal began to kind of drop the pretenses and increasingly called for social and political change. They demanded equal pay, equal access, open government, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, the right to assemble, etc., etc., etc. In fact, even a number of French publications and Frenchmen living in Vietnam were also critical of these policies. One of particular note is a man known as André Malraux, who would go on to be the Minister of Information in 1945 under de Gaulle. He was actually an author who was in Southeast Asia because he thought it was romantic and exciting and was actually arrested for vandalizing Angkor Wat. But he was actually relatively vigorous in denouncing the wretched way that the French government was treating its Vietnamese subjects. And he was not the only liberal French individual who agreed with him on this. Right around the corner was 1929, and the Great Depression is going to hit Vietnam as hard as anyone else.
The Great Depression hit Indochina particularly bad, and as always, the burden fell particularly onto the underclass. In 1930, it was the first year that Indochina actually ran a deficit, and all the previous years having been able to make up a massive amount of money via their export economy. Rubber prices plummeted, and prices shrank for rice and exports. The speculation of the powerful French banking businesses in Vietnam, as well as the Cholan traders of Saigon, also added to this, as bank speculation did in Europe and the Americas. An indigenous scholar at the time did some studies which resulted in the findings where he said that during the Depression, in some areas of the country, up to 80% of the country would only eat one meal a day, and only during the harvest, about 1/3 of the year, was there even enough food for that one meal a day. And on the eve of Great Depression, Indochina had a 20% tax applied more or less on everything other than rice. Some of the Vietnamese elite during this time went heavily into debt in an attempt to maintain their status and their lifestyle, and a number of Chinese from Cholan and other areas simply returned to China given the crushing economic circumstances. This led to strife. There was a peasant revolt in 1930, terrible famine in 1931, and a drought in 1936. Georges Grandjean, future director of Surete, wrote in January 1931, "We no longer have anyone with us. The mandarins, to whom we have only ever gained an insufficient moral and material position, serve us only out of prudence, and anyway cannot do very much. The bourgeoisie probably does not want communism, but it still considers that it could be, as in China, put to excellent use externally, even if it is worthless internally. The educated youth is entirely against us, as is the immense and miserable population of workers and peasants. Truly, something more than simple repression is needed here. It is undoubtedly necessary to reform the material order, but it is no less necessary and urgent to restore calm to people's souls." In 1934, droughts in North China and France drove the price of rice back up as they export to those hungry regions of the world. As well, the national budget was used to grant long-term loans with low interest rates through the Land Loan Service of 1932, which more or less approximated to the peasant taxes being used to bail out the plantation economy. The Bank of Indochina at this time also used its power to further extend its massive reach in the economy, buying up struggling and liquidated businesses. It and the other banking institutions used favoritism to use the massive economic control it had to dole out the recovery and the institutions and the businesses to their favorite clients, and to once more block native Vietnamese ascension into some sort of land-holding middle class. A government official noted, "In spite of regulation and repression, shortages can only translate into constant increases in prices, which has increased the discontent among the masses. Starting from a basis of 100 in 1925, the index of wholesale prices in Saigon increased to 182 in 1943 and to 329 in December 1944. The general European cost of living index rose from 100 in 1925 to 199 in 1943 and to 338 at the end of 1944. The same index in Hanoi was 356 in 1943 and 740 in December 1944. The increase in the cost of living was worse for the indigenous working class. The index in Saigon was 326 in 1943, but 437 at the end of 1944. In Hanoi, it went from 541 to 1,040 during the same period. This growth, which became dizzying at the end of 1944, finally became administratively unmanageable.
So in response to this, unease and tension, anger and frustration, and economic hardships, first political parties began to form in Vietnam with the express intent purpose of independence and an end to colonial exploitation. These include the short-lived Constitutionalist Party of 1917, which predates most of these. The big ones are the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, which is the VNQDD in 1927, and of course Ho Chi Minh's Indochina Communist Party, which finally organized in 1930. 1930 also saw the first real uprisings and revolts since the end of the First World War. The first of these was called the Yen Bai Mutiny in 1930. VNQDD organized. It actually initially organized itself less as a political party and more as a support structure for an uprising. In fact, in a weird way, the Vietnamese Nationalist Party starts out essentially as a revolutionary organization. And the plan with Yen Bai was to use VNQDD organizers to ferment an uprising of colonial soldiers stationed at Yen Bai. And so somewhat similar, I guess, to the Sepoy Mutiny in India, the previous century, the hope was that colonial militias would rise up across the country and throw France out. Unfortunately, the French seemed to have been tipped off about this to some degree and were much more closely scrutinizing both the militia and suspected VNQDD leaders. And the revelation of this actually spooks the party, and rather than call it off, they decide to go early. Hoping for the best, I suppose you might say. On February 10th of 1930, the mutiny happens, and it is an abject failure. The vast majority of soldiers don't participate. Perhaps they had been tipped off, perhaps they were aware of the scrutiny of French authorities, but only a fraction of those who they thought would join actually did. And within 24 hours, the few who did mutiny are quickly rounded up by French authorities. The VNQDD leaders are hunted down, arrested, and executed, notably among them it's one of the most important leaders, Nguyen Thai Hoc.
Nguyen Thai Hoc said, "Life is a game of chance. Chance is against us, and the party now risks complete dissipation of its forces. Once fear enters into the hearts of people, they will lose enthusiasm and faith, and the revolutionary movement will become as cold as the ashes of a long-dead fire. We shall lose all support, and we shall be arrested sooner or later. We shall die slowly, locked in prisons and servitude. Better to die now and leave an example of sacrifice and struggle for future generations. If we fail, at least we shall have become men."
And the party virtually dies out of it. It will reform again, but really only as a shadow of itself, and very much a second fiddle to the Indochina Communist Party by that point. Also in 1930, you saw what's known as the Ngay'an Soviet movement. Now, this is not directly associated with the ICP, but it is a communist organization in the Ngay'an province, which had been organizing and operating basically autonomous peasant communes in that region for some time. And in 1930, they are able to marshal a force of about 6,000 peasants, and they use this armed force to attack and seize the capital of the province, which they will successfully hold for some time. Now, again, much like the Yen Bai Mutiny, French authorities are able to suppress this revolt, but only with extensive military operations and a brutal series of assaults.
The French actually broke out airplanes to machine gun the various worker protesters, and districts where the Soviets were established were usually occupied and partitioned, red villages were burned, and suspects were either arrested or killed.
Now, Ho Chi Minh himself, who was not in Vietnam at this time, he was actually in Hong Kong, attending a party meeting there, was assumably, under French pressure, arrested by British authorities. And the French loudly demanded his extradition, but he was a known communist organizer as well. Though in an interesting twist of, I guess, either the British not caring or wanting to stick it to the French, decide to, after admittedly lengthy legal battle, instead classify him as a political refugee and let him go.
Wall.
And he will actually return to the USSR in 1933, where he will continue his organizing there. He'll be gone for a while, but he'll be back.
During these crackdowns, the French also arrest the entire Central Committee in Saigon in 1931, and the Chinese also break up a Comintern network in June 15.
Beyond this, however, the French continue a general crackdown and repression until 1931, again arresting thousands of suspected political agitators, protesters, suspected communists, suspected nationalists, anyone they can get their hands on. However, unlike previous crackdowns that the French had undertaken, this one does not quite have the effect they had hoped. While open violent resistance seems to have stopped as a result of this, the sort of underground resistance movements only become more intense as a result.
And this conflict also has the added advantage of, after Yin Bei, there was a clear distinction line. Those who would denounce the workers, those who would denounce the strikes and instead side with the French, were definitely seen as collaborationists. Were definitely seen as enemies by this growing social movement.
There's also a sense that, as much as some still call Vietnam backward at this point, there was a greater awareness of the world and society. As the author Dai Do-an said of this, in 1931, the rural folk no longer find the French to be a terrifying race of people, nor do they find their artifacts to be miraculous or fantastic any longer. That aura of invincibility, unreachable power that colonial armies had had in the 19th century is no longer quite so mystical, quite so terrifying to the population willing to resist. Mostly among the urban classes and professionals, but also among workers and peasants as well, there is an increased awareness of what is going on. Again, literacy continues to grow. A slew of books and novels and underground newspapers are still being published. While it's mostly emotional, a lot of it's social, by the end of the decade, open politicization will return. 1932 further sort of demonstrates the French obstinance of actually reforming any aspect of administration, when in that year, Bao Dai, the last emperor of Vietnam, comes throne.
Total baller.
Now, at first, there was some hope that Bao Dai might actually be a reformer. In fact, he himself had some thoughts of this. And the cabinet he appointed actually was very young, relatively liberal, and dominated some by reformers. In fact, the westernizer, Tom Quan, is essentially his prime minister. And also, the future ill-fated president of South Vietnam, the Ngo Dinh Diem, also finds a place there. And these young reformers had visions of being able to make real change in society. But it became quickly apparent that there was no real impetus for this, that real power still rested with the Governor General and the French administration. Diem actually resigns in protest over this. Somewhat ironic, might be one of the only selfless things he ever did in his political career. Pham Quan, as much as he had been an advocate of change and nationalism before, I guess at this point kind of old and bitter, and still at his heart a traditionalist, decides that it's the best he's going to do, and just buckles down and accepts what he's given, which really sort of ends his career as any kind of influential thinker in Vietnamese society. Bao Dai himself shrugs and says, well, I guess I'll go on a long string of vacations, gambling trips, and seductions because my title as emperor clearly means nothing. So I guess there's that. But things, I won't say quiet, they get quiet, but if there is a calm in Vietnamese society at this point, it's the eye of the hurricane. But once again, it's going to be war that changes everything. Increased world tensions in the mid-1930s begin to signal a change on the horizon. And with the invasion of Poland by Germany in 1939 and the beginning of what comes known as the Second World War, once again Vietnam sees an opportunity to break free. And while the process of their war of independence will last a lot longer than they had hoped it would, this war would ultimately be successful. Thank you for watching. This has been part 1 of Paint It Red, our middle entry on the Vietnam Wars. We'll be back with part 2 when COVID-19 permits. Until then, check out our previous episode on the war in Vietnam if you missed it, and our first series before that on the history of Mesopotamia. Be sure to watch Twitter for updates. If you like this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Thank you for watching, and help us grow our channel.